Welcome, weary traveller, to yet another journey through the mists of time. It's a true pleasure to have you here, settling in for a moment of peaceful, immersive history. A gentle escape to help you unwind. Before we begin our story, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? What does the sky look like outside your window? Is it the deep darkness of night, or perhaps a sleepy afternoon? Please share in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you find yourself enjoying these quiet explorations of the past, crafted to both inform and soothe, consider subscribing so you never miss an episode. There's something undeniably comforting about drifting off to the gentle rhythm of history, and I'm honored to be your guide. Tonight, we journey to a world both distant and strangely familiar, the perilous lives of criminals in medieval times. It was an era marked by violence and treachery, yes, but also by acts of daring, profound regret, and the unyielding strength of the human spirit against impossible odds. So, make yourself comfortable, dear listener, as we step back through the centuries to a time when survival was an everyday struggle, and the line between villain and hero was often blurred. Medieval Europe, spanning roughly the 5th to the 15th centuries, was in many ways a world apart from our own. Life's rhythms were set by the seasons, the tolling of church bells, and the rigid hierarchy of the feudal system. For most people, it was a life of relentless hardship, a constant battle against hunger, disease, and the unpredictable whims of those in power. In such a ruthless environment, it's little wonder that some were pushed to the margins, forced into theft and violence simply to survive. Highwaymen haunted the forested roads, pickpockets prowled the bustling markets, and bandits became unlikely heroes to the oppressed peasants. Yet, the medieval world was full of stark contrasts, beside the filth and poverty stood the dazzling splendor of royal courts, the serene hush of cathedrals, and the towering walls of castles. From these seats of authority, harsh and unforgiving justice was imposed on anyone who dared break the rules. Public punishments, torture, and executions were common spectacles, serving as both entertainment and grim warnings. The stocks, the branding iron, the gallows, these tools of suffering loomed large in the popular imagination, stark reminders of the heavy price for stepping outside the bounds of law and tradition. But what of those individuals who found themselves on the wrong side of this merciless system? What desperate circumstances drove them to such risks? And what ultimately became of them? These are the questions we'll be delving into, exploring their gritty, poignant stories through the fog of history. Their tales of boldness and rebellion, of sin and redemption, have much to teach us about the human experience, and just how thin the line is that separates any of us from a life outside the law. So let's listen to their whispers and walk in their footsteps for a while, that we might better understand the cruel twists of fate that shaped their world, and perhaps our own. But first, a word of caution. The journey we're about to undertake is not for the faint of heart. The medieval underworld was a grim, unforgiving realm where life was, for many, nasty, brutal, and all too short. Yet, this is precisely where its morbid fascination lies. The knowledge that these were real people, driven to the edge by circumstances we can barely imagine. Through the magic of storytelling, we can bring their stories to life, if only for a fleeting, haunting moment. Not to glorify their actions, but to witness their essential humanity. So, steel yourself, dear listener, as we descend into the dark heart of the Middle Ages. Take comfort, though, in knowing that the terrors of that distant world can no longer reach us. We are safe in the present, sheltered by the hard-won security and civility of modern life. And yet, as we drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps we'll spare a thought for those less fortunate souls, the ones who lived and died by the sword, the noose, and the iron grip of medieval justice. May their stories endure as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable adversity. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we plunge into the depths, let's take a moment to set the scene. Picture, if you will, Europe in the 1200s, a patchwork of feudal kingdoms, each ruled by a monarch whose power was absolute, at least in name, for the vast majority, the peasants, serfs, and villeins who toiled in the fields and huddled in thatched huts. Life was a relentless cycle of back-breaking labour and grinding poverty, they were bound to the land, subject to the whims of their lords, and utterly at the mercy of the elements. In good times they might scrape by, but more often their lives were overturned by forces beyond their control. A failed harvest could mean starvation. A marauding army could reduce their village to ashes, and always, the shadow of disease loomed, the dreaded plague that struck without warning and wiped out entire communities. Against this bleak backdrop, is it any wonder that crime found fertile ground, for those on society's margins, with nothing left to lose, the lure of the open road and the glint of stolen gold could prove irresistible. And so, they took to the highways and byways, these desperate souls, the outlaws, the brigands, the highwaymen. Some were driven purely by the instinct to survive, stealing to stave off hunger, others were motivated by a thirst for adventure or a desire to strike back at a system that had left them destitute and powerless. And a few, perhaps, were simply born to it, possessed of a darkness that no circumstance could excuse, Whatever their reasons, these medieval wrongdoers soon loomed large in the popular imagination. Their exploits were celebrated in ballads and penny dreadfuls, their grim fates, held up as warnings to others. And it is into their world that we now journey, dear listener, a world of danger and desperation, of high stakes and harsh reckonings. But fear not, for I will be your steadfast guide, shedding light on the shadowy corners of history with the flickering lamp of scholarship. Together, we'll unravel the social and economic forces that gave rise to medieval crime and the often horrific methods used to suppress it. Along the way, we'll meet some of the era's most notorious outlaws, men like Jack Cornwall, the peasant farmer turned highwayman, O-Robber, and Eustace Folville, the aristocratic gang leader with a Robin Hood complex. Together, we'll trace their paths, from their first hesitant steps into a life of crime to their eventual downfall, whether that came at the end of a rope or in a hard-won moment of redemption. Along the way, we'll confront the brutal realities of medieval justice, the grisly spectacles of public torture and execution meant to serve as dire warnings to would-be offenders. We'll venture into the dank, dismal dungeons where the accused awaited their fate, and examine the ingenious instruments of pain used to force confessions from both the guilty and the innocent. Yet, we'll also pause to consider the human stories behind the lurid headlines, the tales of love and loss, hope and despair that animate even the most hardened outlaws. For in the end, these were not monsters, but men and women pushed to the edge by a world that offered them precious little mercy. So, settle in, dear listener, as we journey back to an age when life was cheap and justice was swift and merciless, a time when the line between hero and villain was blurred, and the price of survival might well be one's very soul, It's a grim and haunting tale, to be sure, but one shot through with moments of courage, compassion, and even dark humour, for in the face of unimaginable adversity, the human spirit has a way of enduring, of finding light in the darkest places and hope where there seems to be none. And so, as we embark on this journey through the underworld of medieval Europe, let us do so with open minds and compassionate hearts. Let us seek understanding rather than judgment, striving to find the humanity even within the most desperate and depraved of our ancestors. In doing so, perhaps we'll see our own world in a new light, appreciating the progress we've made and recognizing the work that still lies ahead. And maybe, just maybe, Ezra will discover a touch of empathy for those who came before us, the lost and the damned, the sinners and the saints who lived and died in a world of unimaginable brutality. But enough of my philosophizing. The hour grows late, and the mists of time beckon. Let us cross the threshold together into a world of cutpurses and cudgels, of gallows and gibbets, a world where survival was a daily struggle and mercy was rare. Welcome, dear listener, to the dark heart of the medieval underworld. May you find here not just a morbid fascination, but also moments of unexpected poignancy, glimmers of light in the gathering gloom, and may you emerge from this journey with a renewed appreciation for the fragile blessings of peace, prosperity, and the rule of law. But I have lingered too long in setting the stage. The players await, and the drama is ready to unfold. So steel yourself, gentle listener, and let us descend together into the depths of the distant past, a past not so very far removed from our own, echoing still across the ages for those willing to listen. Come, then, let us heed its call and discover what grim wonders await us in the annals of medieval crime and punishment. As we drift deeper into this sordid underworld, let us turn our attention to one of the most infamous types of outlaw in this era, the charismatic bandit. While many highwaymen and robbers were driven to their crimes by desperation and poverty, a rare few seemed to revel in the excitement of the heist and the admiration of the common folk they claimed to champion. One such dashing rogue was Eustace Folville, was a 14th century gentleman turned outlaw who became something of a folk hero in the English Midlands. Born into a well-respected family in Leicester, Folville seemed destined for a life of comfort and privilege. However, a bitter family feud and a rebellious spirit soon set him on a very different course. Legend has it that Folville took up arms against the crown after his cousin was unjustly imprisoned by the Sheriff of Nottingham. Swearing revenge, Eustace gathered a loyal band of followers and set out to make the sheriff pay for his misdeeds. In a daring raid, they ambushed and killed the sheriff and several of his men before disappearing into the dense Sherwood forest, which became their sanctuary. But instead of simply fleeing as fugitives, Folville and his gang embarked on a bold new career as outlaws with a twist. They targeted society's most despised figures, the tax collectors. In an age marked by crushing inequality, the ruthless collection of taxes and levies was deeply resented by peasants who could barely feed their families. By robbing these collectors, often relieving them of their ill-gotten gains and perhaps keeping a share for themselves, Folville's gang quickly won the admiration of the masses. The most legendary of their heists occurred in 1326 during the reign of King Edward II. On a foggy morning, Eustace and his men ambushed a royal caravan laden with taxes collected by the infamous Duke of Exeter. The robbery was a resounding success, and while the exact sum is lost to history, the haul was said to be enormous. True to his reputation, Folville ensured that a generous portion of the spoils made its way to the impoverished locals, securing their eternal gratitude and loyalty. Of course, such brazen crimes against the crown could not go unpunished forever. Royal writs were issued denouncing Folville as a notorious robber, and a hefty bounty was placed on his head. Members of his family were imprisoned in hopes of flushing him out, while bands of sheriffs and soldiers scoured the countryside for Eustace and his gang. Yet, thanks to local support, cunning evasions, and perhaps sheer audacity, Eustace and the Folville gang managed to elude capture for years. They became local legends, the gentleman thief, and his merry men who robbed the rich, aided the poor, and mocked the powers that be. Embellished tales of Eustace's exploits spread like wildfire through alehouses and marketplaces, growing more fantastical with each telling. Some stories claimed Eustace had a secret network of tunnels beneath the forest to spirit away his loot. Others swore he could transform into a fox to evade the hounds set on his trail. Most famous of all was the tale of his archery contest with the devil himself, in which Folville wagered his soul on a test of skill, only to outwit the fiend with an impossible trick shot. As entertaining as these folk tales are, the truth is we may never know the full story behind the legend of Eustace Folville. The few scraps of historical record suggest he did indeed lead a gang of highwaymen in Leicester for over a decade, robbing and killing at least a dozen men along the way, and in a strange twist of fate for an outlaw, in a remarkable twist of fate, Eustace was eventually pardoned by the very king who had long sought to see him hanged. In 1334, now middle-aged and weary from years as a fugitive, Folville threw himself on the mercy of the young King Edward Carré, and, much to everyone's astonishment, received it. Historians believe this unexpected pardon was due, in part, to shifting political tides at court that left Folville's old enemies out of favour. Whatever the reason, with his slate wiped clean, Eustace Folville retired to his family estates, a free and wealthy man. He spent his remaining years as a respected local figure, serving, ironically, as bailiff and justice of the peace. When he died around 1347, Eustace was buried in the Folville family chapel, his gravestone adorned with a jaunty effigy of a sword, bearing knight, the very image of a medieval gentleman. So, what are we to make of the swashbuckling saga of Eustace Folville? Was he truly a heroic rogue who defended the downtrodden against their oppressors, or merely a self-serving criminal with a flair for public relations? As is so often the case, the truth likely lies somewhere in between. Like his legendary successor Robin Hood a century later, Eustace was an outlaw who captured the public imagination and cast himself as a champion of the people, even as he profited handsomely from his crimes. Yet, in an age marked by such brutal inequality and injustice, perhaps even a bandit who dared to mock the powerful and share a taste of their riches with the poor seemed a hero. Though Eustace Folville's swashbuckling days are long past, his legend endures, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the medieval world, a spark of light could ignite hope and wonder. With a wink and a wandering hand, figures like Folville brought desperate people a dose of hope, mirth, and mischief in lives so often starved for all three. While we may not endorse their methods from our comfortable vantage point today, we must admit these dashing outlaws added a much-needed splash of colour to an otherwise bleak and dreary era. One can almost imagine Eustace among his men in a smoky tavern, regaling an eager crowd with tales of his latest exploits as tankards clatter and the minstrel plays. So let us raise a glass to Eustace Folville, the gentleman thief, forest fox, and gallant rogue who tweaked the nose of tyrants and, for a brief shining moment, brought a touch of justice to an unjust age. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and watch out for sly foxes on the road, as the warm glow of Eustace's tale fades into the mists of history, we find ourselves drawn onward, ready to explore yet another shadowy facet of medieval crime, one with a far more sombre and complex character. For while roguish bandits like Folville may capture our imagination, the truth is that most medieval lawbreakers were neither so dashing, nor their ends so gentle. Next, we peer into the fraught and fearful world of crime and punishment for women in the Middle Ages. Beneath the grim, pious surface of medieval society, dark currents of suspicion, superstition, and misogyny often ran deep, dragging countless women into the maw of justice. For a woman to be drawn into the criminal underworld of this era was, indeed, a terrifying prospect. Tragically, the path to crime for medieval women was often, for many women, the road to crime in the Middle Ages was paved by nothing more than desperation. With little access to education, employment, or property rights, an unmarried or widowed woman faced daunting odds just to survive. Those who managed to avoid the worst poverty often became trapped in the world's oldest profession, as others, separated from family, fleeing abuse, or simply alone, might resort to begging, vagrancy, or petty theft in order to get by, yet these so-called crimes of poverty left countless women exposed to the harsh, unyielding brutality of medieval law. While a man might face a lashing or a brief stint in jail for minor offences, women often suffered far worse. Savage floggings, public humiliation, and lengthy stretches in filthy dungeons were common punishments, delivered with little regard for the desperate circumstances that led to their so-called misdeeds, even more disturbing was the ease with which authorities could invent charges of moral offence against unruly or inconvenient women, the Inquisition was all too eager to extract confessions of witchcraft, heresy, or sexual impropriety, often through torture, village gossip or the word of a spurned lover could be enough to spark accusations that led to a woman being burned, drowned, or banished, patriarchal paranoia left women intensely vulnerable to such purges. Perhaps no crime inspired more horror and fury in the medieval mind than infanticide, in an era with scarce birth control and zero tolerance for unwed mothers, untold numbers of desperate women resorted to the unthinkable. If discovered, these acts brought no sympathy, only swift and merciless punishment. Infanticidal mothers were routinely tortured, paraded in shame, and executed before jeering crowds, one infamous case is that of Margaret Kittsteiner, a 17-year-old German peasant who, in 1580, drowned her newborn in a well. Arrested and brutally interrogated, Margaret confessed under torture not only to infanticide, but also to witchcraft and consorting with the devil. Further denounced by spiteful neighbours, she suffered public humiliation, savage lashes, and was ultimately beheaded before a mocking mob. While Kittsteiner's case is relatively well documented, the shocking cruelty she endured was all too common for women on the margins of medieval society. Across Europe, countless others met similar fates simply for failing to uphold a rigid patriarchal order, even as we recoil at their actions, we must shudder at the misogynistic machinery of torment and death that awaited so many women. So let us pause and reflect, with mingled sorrow and anger, on the legions of tragic Margarets, the desperate, the discarded, the demonized, who haunt the neglected footnotes of history. These are the faces we cannot quite picture, the names left unrecorded, the injustices unredressed even today. We are left to wonder just how many innocent lives were shattered under the pitiless hammer of a society so fearful of the feminine. Yet, as we slip softly into slumber, let us take some comfort in the progress, however slow and uneven, that has made our world a more humane and hospitable place for our sisters than it was in those dark days. Ours is a world that, in fits and starts, strives to lift up the fallen and empower the powerless. And while medieval justice in the medieval world remains a nightmare that can still jolt us awake, yet with each generation we inch a little closer to a brighter dawn. Rest well, weary traveller, and take heart, you are not alone on this long, hard-fought road. In the Middle Ages, the divide between life and death was far more fragile than it is today. Disease, famine, and violence were constant threats. It's little wonder, then, that some turned to crime out of sheer desperation. The brutal punishments awaiting those caught were often no match for the realities of gnawing hunger or the intoxicating lure of quick riches. Among the most notorious of these medieval malefactors was Jack Cornwall, a humble peasant farmer who became a highway robber in 14th century England. Born into poverty and raised in a ramshackle hovel, Jack spent his days labouring in the fields from sunup to sundown, working himself to the bone for the local lord in exchange for a few meagre scraps. As the years wore on, Jack watched helplessly as his family slowly starved, his once rosy, cheeked children reduced to little more than skin and bone. At last, something inside him broke, he could no longer stand to see his loved ones suffer while the wealthy grew fat on the fruits of his labor. So Jack devised a plan, desperate but daring, under the cover of darkness, he began to waylay wealthy travelers on the lonely forest roads. At first, he had little more than a sturdy club and a menacing glare, but as his confidence grew, so did his ambition. Soon, Jack graduated to a rusted sword scavenged from a dead soldier and a battered black mask to hide his identity. His method was simple, but effective. Jack would lie in wait behind a blind curve, his lean frame hidden in the thick underbrush. When an unsuspecting traveler approached, he'd leap out with a fearsome shout, brandishing his blade and demanding their purse. Most were so startled they handed over their valuables without protest. In this way, Jack Cornwall managed to eke out a living on the margins of society, his ill-gotten gains providing a sorely needed supplement to his family's meagre income. For a time, it seemed as though he might actually get away with it, until a chance encounter sealed his fate. One night, Jack confronted a wealthy merchant, who proved far less timid than his usual victims. When Jack demanded his gold, the merchant drew a dagger from his cloak and lunged with surprising speed. Caught off guard, Jack stumbled backward, cracking his head on a stone. The last thing he saw before blacking out was the merchant's triumphant face looming over him. Jack awoke to find himself shackled in a dank, foul-smelling cell, his head throbbing and his mouth parched. He languished there for days, time oozing by in the chilling damp and pestilential rot of his dungeon. Rare shafts of light seeped through the cracks, tinged with an ominous red, as if the very sun had been stained by centuries of suffering. When the day of his trial finally arrived, Jack was hauled before a court of landed nobles and smug clerics, their jeweled fingers and sumptuous robes a sharp contrast to his filthy rags and gaunt, unshaven face. He knew at once he could expect no mercy from such an audience, the proceedings were a mere formality, a foregone conclusion. The merchant, with a sneer, recounted Jack's attack in lurid, exaggerated detail, casting himself as the valiant hero who had subdued a deranged and bloodthirsty villain. No one asked for Jack's side of the story, no one cared that his crimes had been born from deprivation and despair rather than greed or malice. At the end, the sentence was as swift as it was cruel death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn. A hush fell over the courtroom, broken only by a strangled sob from Jack's wife, who had come to witness her husband's fate, their infant cradled in her arms. That night in his cell, Jack stared at the cold stone walls, the flickering torchlight casting wild, demonic shadows across their damp surface, he thought of his family, the aching hunger and heartbreak his death would leave behind. But most of all, he brooded on the bitter unfairness of it all, the vast gulf between the haves and have-nots that had swallowed him whole. As the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the bars of his cell window, he almost welcomed the oblivion that awaited, they came for him at first light, a trio of burly guards who hauled him from the filthy straw and dragged him, stumbling, into the morning chill. A small crowd had gathered to witness the end, their faces a blend of pity, contempt, and morbid curiosity. In the crowd, he glimpsed his wife, tears streaking her pale cheeks as she clutched their wailing infant son, Jack barely noticed the rough hemp of the noose as it tightened around his neck. He was consumed by the anguish in his wife's eyes. The hooded executioner muttered a half-hearted prayer, for the benefit of the crowd rather than the condemned, and then, with a sudden jerk and a sickening crack, Jack Cornwall, peasant, husband, highwayman, was no more, just another wretched soul ground beneath the wheels of a merciless world. His body was left to sway in the wind, a grim warning to any who might follow in his footsteps. A forlorn human scarecrow, unheeded by the circling carrion birds. Passers-by would later say his lifeless face seemed etched with a sadness deeper than death itself, a a silent lament for the injustice that had shaped his life, and so many others like him. In time, Jack's story faded from memory, swallowed by the countless ranks of the downtrodden and desperate, but for a fleeting moment, his name had stood as a symbol of defiance against a world hopelessly stacked against men like him, a small, flickering light of resistance in an age of darkness. Such public spectacles of harsh justice were all too common in medieval Europe, in an age without a formal police force or systematic law enforcement, grisly punishments were considered a necessary deterrent to keep the restless rabble in line. The logic was brutally simple: make the example horrific enough, and others would think twice before straying into crime. And so, miscreants might find themselves subjected to a litany of stomach-churning torments. Flogging was a popular choice, the lash biting deep into quivering flesh until the victim's back suffered and languished in those hellish confines. Some prisoners left their mark on the dungeon walls, scratched messages and crude drawings, many of which survive to this day, faded yet still legible. These are ghostly whisperings from a distant age of sorrow. Few prisoners emerged from such nightmarish captivity unscathed. Even those who escaped the worst tortures were often broken in body and spirit, aged beyond their years by the relentless trauma of confinement. Some simply wasted away, succumbing to disease or starvation, unmourned and forgotten in the darkness. Others, unable to bear another day in such purgatory, took their own lives, hanging themselves with knotted bedsheets, or dashing their heads against the unyielding stone until blessed oblivion claimed them. Such was the ferocious tenacity of the human will to suffer, that these acts of self-annihilation were often the only form of agency left to the damned. Yet, amidst all this anguish and abasement, there were fleeting moments of grim solidarity. Prisoners would sometimes band together, sharing what meagre scraps of food or comfort they could muster. They told stories or sang bawdy songs to stave off despair, their defiant laughter ringing out in the fated darkness as a testament to an unbroken spirit. In the dungeons, the usual barriers of class and status melted away. A common wretchedness bound the inmates together, from lowly pickpocket to disgraced nobleman, all were equals in the eyes of the dank stone walls and scurrying rats. In that shared degradation, they found a strange kinship, a reminder that even in the depths of misery, humanity endures. For most, of course, it was only a temporary reprieve. The grim fate awaiting them, beyond the dungeon walls, loomed ever-present, an inescapable doom. But for a few precious moments, in that camaraderie of the damned, they could forget the horror of their lot and feel, if only briefly, a little less alone in the uncaring void of a brutal world. Such was the lot of the medieval prisoner, a descent into a lightless underworld of suffering and despair, where the only true escape was often death itself. And yet, even in that abyss of torment, the indomitable human spirit flickered on, an ember of defiance amidst the all-consuming dark. But not all who ran afoul of the law were doomed to such a bleak and anonymous end. Some, through a combination of wit, daring, and sheer brazenness, managed to carve out a strange sort of celebrity for themselves, becoming the stuff of tavern songs and whispered legend. Such was the case with Eustace Folville, a dashing 14th-century outlaw who both charmed and bedeviled the English Midlands. Born to a once proud family fallen on hard times, young Eustace seemed destined for a life of genteel poverty and obscurity. But a smouldering resentment burned in his breast, a sense that the world owed him more than the meagre lot he'd been handed. And so, like many a desperate man before him, Eustace turned to a life of crime. But where others relied on brute force and crude banditry, Folville wielded a rakish charm and keen wit that soon made him the talk of the Shire. With a band of loyal followers at his side, he set about relieving wealthy travellers of their gold with a smile and a courtly bow. But Eustace Folville was no ordinary thief. He fashioned himself as a Robin Hood figure, a dashing rogue who robbed the rich to aid the poor, though he made sure to keep a generous share for himself. He cultivated an air of gentility, donning fine clothes and presenting himself as a wronged nobleman, forced into outlawry by cruel circumstance. This carefully crafted persona served him well. Stories of his exploits spread far and wide, growing more extravagant in each retelling. Peasants whispered admiringly of the gallant highwayman who bested the wealthy at their own game, while ladies swooned at the thought of such a dangerous yet magnetic rogue. Even some of his victims couldn't help but be charmed by his silver tongue and dashing demeanor, Fulville's specialty was harassing tax collectors and agents of the crown, a perilous pursuit that earned him hero status among the overtaxed populace, he and his band would lie in wait along lonely forest roads, springing out to ambush unsuspecting officials and relieve them of their burdensome chests of coin, These daring raids became the stuff of legend, with Eustace's merry men always vanishing into the greenwood before the sheriff's forces could catch their scent, the people revelled in stories of wily outlaws thumbing their noses at the grasping royal authorities. In Eustace Fulville, they found a champion, however vicarious, against the crushing weight of the feudal order. Of course, the powers that be were far less amused by Fulville's antics. They pursued him relentlessly, determined to make an example of this audacious upstart who so openly mocked their authority. Yet Eustace always seemed to stay one step ahead, foiling their traps with cunning ruses and daring escapes. Once, it was said, he allowed himself to be captured only to slip his bonds at the last moment, leading his bewildered pursuers on a wild chase through a nearby village, vaulting fences and clambering up drainpipes as they stumbled after him. By the time they regrouped, he had already vanished, his mocking laughter echoing in their ears, on another occasion, cornered in a disreputable tavern, Eustace reportedly donned a monk's habit and blacked out his teeth with soot, posing as a doddering old friar. When the sheriff's men arrived, he confounded them with crazed gibberish and wild capering until, in exasperation, they left, never realizing how close they had come to their quarry. Such bold escapades only burnished Fulville's aura of rakish invincibility in the popular imagination. He became larger than life, a figure of myth and romance, a laughing cavalier who played the mighty for fools and always slipped through the fingers of his bumbling pursuers. He was no degenerate cutthroat, but a proper gentleman of the road. Yet, of course, reality was likely far less rosy. For all his flair and panic, Eustace was still a hunted man, forced to live on the margins and in constant fear of capture, and while he played at being a friend to the downtrodden, his exploits often left honest travellers and merchants impoverished and shaken. Still, this could not completely dim his lustre in the eyes of a people desperate for any glimmer of hope or defiance in a bleak and oppressive world. In Eustace Fulville, the people found a dashing avatar onto whom they could project their own fantasies of resistance and wish fulfillment. His legend soon grew to overshadow the squalid realities of his trade, and in this, perhaps, we glimpse a lesson about the human capacity for myth-making, the eternal yearning for romance and heroism, even amid misery. Faced with the grinding brutalities of a world arrayed against them, the common folk sought solace in tall tales and the comforting fiction of the noble outlaw. For Eustace Fulville, charming predator, gallant rogue, an enigma wrapped in homespun legend, may have been, in large part, a creation of desperate imagination. Yet in breathing life into his fanciful exploits, his admirers also nurtured the embers of their own hope. As we've seen, the life of a medieval criminal was often nasty, brutish, and short. But amid all the cruelty and squalor, there were glimmers of humanity, even among the most notorious outlaws, Consider the story of Robert of Alton, a disgraced knight who terrorized 13th century England. Born to a noble family, Robert seemed destined for a life of chivalry and honor. But war had other plans, while fighting in France, he committed unspeakable atrocities against civilians, burning villages, slaughtering women and children. The carnage fractured his mind, and Robert returned home a changed man, his soul shattered, his conscience unbound. Turning to crime, Robert embarked on a one-man reign of terror across the English countryside. No traveller was safe from his ambushes. He killed indiscriminately, driven by some inner torment. The crown put a handsome bounty on the mad knight's head but Robert's cunning and brutality kept him one step ahead of the law, until one cold autumn evening, when his luck finally ran out. Villagers he had been terrorizing lay in wait and captured Robert in a dramatic showdown. In chains, he was hauled before the magistrate to face a long list of heinous charges. The kingdom clamoured for Robert's head, and a public execution was hastily arranged, hanging, drawing, and quartering, to serve as a warning to other would-be bandits. The Mad Knight's fate was sealed, but a strange thing happened in Robert's dank dungeon cell. As he awaited his grisly end, the killer began to repent. According to legend, Robert furiously wrote his life story on mouldy parchment by the light of a single candle. In shaky prose, he confessed his sins and begged for God's mercy. Robert's 11th hour conversion became the talk of the town. Could such an evil man truly be saved? Debate raged as the execution loomed. Chroniclers say a priest snuck into the dungeon and heard the knight's last confession, administering final rites. Grim crowds gathered for Robert's hanging at dawn, eager to see the notorious killer receive justice. But the broken man who stood before them was not the same defiant outlaw. Head bowed, Robert publicly recanted his crimes and begged the victims' families for forgiveness. As he stepped up to the gallows, he extended his bound wrists to the executioner and gazed to the heavens. "Lord," he cried, "they will be done." The noose snapped tight, and the knight went limp, his body left to twist in the wind as a macabre reminder. Robert's story became a medieval sensation. The murderer who found God in his darkest hour. His crude autobiography was copied and circulated, becoming an early true crime bestseller. Some believed Robert's conversion was genuine, others scoffed, seeing only a desperate ploy to avoid damnation. But in a world with so little mercy, even a glimmer of redemption captured the public imagination. Robert's grisly end became a popular subject for gory medieval morality plays, where his final penitence always earned an angel's pardon. In the end, Robert of Alton's story endures, not only for the horror of his crimes, but for the haunting power of his remorse. His tale is deeply human, a story of sin, punishment, and the eternal hope for forgiveness. Even in the face of certain death, it is never too late to repent. While Robert's violent path may have been extreme, his yearning for salvation was anything but unique. Across the Middle Ages, countless condemned souls sought to make peace with God before facing the executioner. The Church's influence was profound, and the promise of divine mercy was often a condemned man's last comfort. Medieval execution rituals were as much about spiritual redemption as physical punishment. Proceedings would often begin with an elaborate public mass, where the condemned received last rites. A priest would then escort the criminal to the scaffold, urging repentance and leading prayers. Even the execution itself could take on a grotesque religious symbolism, some gallows were shaped like a crucifix, allowing felons to die in the same manner as Christ. The spilling of their blood was linked, in the public imagination, to holy sacrifice. Yet even after death, indignities remained. Most executed criminals, considered to have died in a state of sin, were the state's property to dispose of as it pleased. Many bodies were handed over to medical schools for crude dissections, grisly lessons for aspiring physicians. Others were gibbeted, left to rot in iron cages, as a stark warning to passers-by, But not all criminals went quietly to such fates. Some, right up to the end, resisted violently, making desperate bids for escape or rescue. Others faced their execution with stoic defiance, refusing to repent or beg for mercy. A few even used their final moments as an act of rebellion. The scaffold became an early speaker's corner, with condemned outlaws denouncing the corrupt system or pleading their cause before the assembled crowds. The most famous of these was William Wallace, the Scottish rebel, who in 1305 used his last breath to cry out for freedom before being hanged, drawn, and quartered. His final shout of mercy was not for himself, but for the common people suffering under English rule. Stories of such dramatic ends spread quickly, and some doomed criminals seized their last chance for immortality, determined to be remembered as martyrs and folk heroes. For men and women with little power in life, choosing how they faced death was their final act of agency, their last chance to shape their own legacy. So, while the violent lives of medieval criminals most often ended at the scaffold, their stories lived on, whispered around campfires, scribbled in chronicles, and enacted on festival stages. In a largely illiterate society, tales of daring outlaws, jailhouse repenters, and defiant martyrs became a kind of medieval pop culture. For peasants ground down by poverty and powerlessness, these legends were a source of grim fascination and vicarious thrills, they offered a fleeting glimpse of adventure beyond the drudgery of feudal life, and sometimes provided a subtle outlet for social criticism, a commoner's eye view of injustice and the arbitrary cruelty of authority. Of course, we must be cautious not to romanticize the criminals of the Middle Ages, nor to read too much into their enduring legends. Most were desperate outcasts, not gallant rogues, and their victims' suffering was all too real. But in a world with so little empathy for the poor and powerless, even their grisly stories found an eager audience, So what are we to make of the brutal lives of medieval criminals? In the end, on one level, they simply reflect the harshness of their era, a world of rampant inequality, cruelty, and superstition. Theirs was not a romantic age, but a pitiless one, driving many to unspeakable deeds. Yet, if we listen closely to the whispers of humanity amid the horror, a more nuanced picture emerges, behind every medieval outlaw tale is a real person, pushed to the brink by hardship, broken by trauma, or twisted by unchecked power. Their crimes may repel us, but they're all too human flaws and yearnings echo across the centuries. We see in them the reflection of our own potential for both cruelty and redemption. How many of us, ground down by poverty or pain, might be capable of terrible things? Perhaps the true value in pondering these long-ago criminal lives is the empathy it stirs, a recognition of our shared frailties and hopes, For all our modern sophistication, are we really so different from our medieval forebears, stumbling through a world that is often brutish and unfair? As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander back to those distant days of chainmail and dungeons, plagues and putrid streets. Picture yourself as some scrawny medieval peasant, gazing up at the severed heads above the town gates. What flickers of life, however unfortunate, once animated those vacant eyes? Hold that thought as you slip into dreams, your warm bed a world away from a cold stone cell. Breathe in gratitude for a relatively gentle modern age. The monstrous criminals of the Middle Ages have long since crumbled to dust, but their very human stories linger, inviting us to ponder the crooked timber of our species. And so our grim historical tour draws to a close, The next time you find yourself grumbling about some petty modern inconvenience, cast your mind back to the short, ungentle lives of medieval criminals. Suddenly, that long line at the DMV might not seem so dire. Progress may be imperfect, but it's a hard-won gift. Sleep well, dear listener, and dream of kender centuries. Let the muffled sounds of the modern world, the hum of late night traffic, the muted bark of neighborhood dogs soothe you into slumber. As a how lucky we are to drift off without fear of barbarians at the gates or brigands lurking in the shadows. Our world is still far from perfect, of course, but it is a far cry from the desperate, as a disease-ridden societies that drove so many medieval men and women to unspeakable acts. We may yet build a civilization where fewer fall through the cracks into brutality. The arc of history is long, but perhaps it bends toward mercy in the end. So rest now, and savor these last drowsy moments of wakefulness, poised between the dark dreams of history and the gradual dawn of a better world, let the hard-earned lessons of the past whisper into your waiting ears, and may your sleep be sweet and your tomorrows ever more gentle. As we've seen, the life of a medieval criminal was often brutish and short, shaped by the harsh realities of poverty, inequality, and a ruthless justice system. Yet amidst the darkness, there were also flashes of defiance, ingenuity, and even gallantry from those who lived outside the law. Take the case of Adam the Welshman, a wily outlaw who haunted the wilds of northern England in the early 14th century. Born to a poor family in the rugged hills of Wales, Adam turned to a life of crime as a young man, driven by a combination of desperation and a thirst for adventure. With a band of loyal followers, Adam made a name for himself as a kind of Robin Hood figure, renowned for his daring heists against wealthy travelers and his generosity to the poor peasants who sheltered him. Adam's exploits became the stuff of folklore, it was said he could vanish into the forest like a ghost, that he wore a magic cloak rendering him invisible, and that he could charm the coins out of any man's purse with his quick wit and silver tongue. But the reality was likely far less romantic. Life on the run was cold, hungry, and perilous, Adam and his followers slept rough in the woods, always alert to the threat of betrayal or capture. They relied on a network of secret caves and sympathetic villagers to evade the authorities, and when they struck, it was often with ruthless precision, leaving behind a trail of bodies and terrified survivors. For years, Adam managed to stay one step ahead of the law, even as his legend and notoriety grew. Local sheriffs put a bounty on his head and hired special constables to hunt him down. But Adam was a cunning foe. He bribed officials, intimidated witnesses, and eliminated traitors within his own ranks to protect himself. However, as with most outlaws, Adam's luck eventually ran out. Betrayed by a jealous lover, he was ambushed by a posse of armed men in a small village where he had gone to visit his mother. A fierce struggle ensued, but Adam was outnumbered and captured. Shackled and battered, he was marched back to the nearest town to stand trial. In the makeshift courtroom, Adam faced the magistrate. His face bruised, his wrists raw from the shackles. The charges were read aloud: murder, robbery, extortion, and a litany of other crimes. The crowded room jeered and hissed, hungry for vengeance. Yet even in this dire hour, Adam remained defiant. According to legend, when the magistrate asked if he had any last words, Adam flashed his trademark grin and quipped, my lord, I may hang for my crimes, but at least I had the courage to live free, which is more than I can say for these bootlickers and sycophants you call subjects." The magistrate was not amused, Adam was sentenced to be hanged until dead, his body to be displayed as a warning to other would-be brigands. The execution was carried out swiftly in the town square, attended by a braying mob of peasants and merchants, who cheered as the life drained from the outlaw's body. In death, Adam the Welshman passed into legend as the dashing rogue who stood up to the wealthy and powerful, the merry trickster who eluded capture for so long, the martyr who died a criminal but lived as a free man, Ballads were sung of his exploits for generations, though the details grew ever more fantastical with each retelling. But for every Adam the Welshman, for every romanticized outlaw hero, there were dozens more petty thieves, cutpurses, and highwaymen who met miserable ends with little fanfare. The vast majority of medieval criminals were desperate as damaged souls, pushed to the margins by a brutally unequal society and forced to prey on each other just to survive Take the tragic story of Will Scathlock, a simple cottager from Sussex, who in a fit of drunken rage bludgeoned his wife to death with a shovel in 1432. A habitual drunkard and notorious brute, Will was well known in his village for his full temper and quick fists. His long-suffering wife Mary bore the brunt of his violence for years, until that fateful night when he finally went too far. Realizing what he had done, Will fled into the woods, leaving his wife's broken body for their children to find in the morning. For months, Will survived by stealing scraps from rubbish heaps and slaughtering livestock from fields, slowly losing his grip on reality as guilt, paranoia, and starvation gnawed at him. He was finally caught by the local reeve, curled up half dead in a drainage ditch, mumbling incoherently. Hauled before the manor court, he openly confessed to his crime and begged for mercy. But there was no mercy for a wife killer in those days. Will was sentenced to be pressed to death. A slow, agonizing execution where heavy stones were piled on the condemned's chest until they suffocated. As he lay gasping on the ground, feeling his ribs crack and his lungs collapse under the crushing weight, Will Scathlock must have reflected on the bleak trajectory of his life in the poverty, the squalor, the constant gnawing hunger in his belly, the anger seething in his heart at a world that had given him nothing but hardship and pain. With his last breath, he rasped out a warning to the assembled crowd. Beware the demon drink, friends. It made me a monster and brought me to this wretched end. Will Scathlock's story was all too common in an age where grinding poverty, rampant alcoholism, and unchecked domestic violence created a perfect storm of human misery. Like so many of his fellow criminals, Will was a product of his cruel, unforgiving environment, a man whose worst impulses were sharpened to a murderous edge by the daily struggle of medieval life. Yet, among the suffering and squalor, a few managed to rise above their circumstances and achieve a measure of infamy, if not outright fame, through their audacious crimes. One such figure was Jean de Clesson, a 14th-century Breton noblewoman turned pirate queen, who terrorized the English Channel for over a decade. Jean's story began as a fairy tale romance. As a young girl, she was married off to the wealthy Breton Lord Olivier de Clisson. By all accounts, it was a happy union, blessed with several children and a life of luxury and privilege. But their idyll was shattered in 1343, when Olivier was captured by the English during the Breton War of Succession and publicly beheaded as a traitor. Jeanne was consumed by grief and rage at the unjust execution of her beloved husband. According to legend, she took her 2 young sons to witness their father's gruesome death, then made them swear a blood oath on his severed head to avenge him. Determined to make the English pay for their crime, Jean sold off her estates and used the proceeds to finance a pirate fleet of her own. She had her ships painted black and their sails dyed blood red, earning her the nickname, the Lioness of Brittany. With her sons and a crew of hardened mercenaries, she set out to wreak havoc on English shipping lanes. For 13 years, Jean de Clesson was the scourge of the Channel, capturing and pillaging dozens of English merchant vessels. She became renowned for her ruthlessness, personally beheading any English nobleman she captured and tossing their bodies into the sea. Her exploits became so notorious that the English crown put a massive bounty on her head, but Jean always managed to elude capture. As her pirate career flourished, she used her wealth to build a network of spies and informants across Europe, funneling vital intelligence to the French king to aid his war against the English. She even bankrolled several assassinations against English nobles, though none were successful. But time and tide wait for no one, not even a pirate queen. As she entered her 50s, Jean's health began to fail and her bloodlust finally cooled. After a particularly harrowing battle in 1356, where she was nearly captured, she decided to retire from piracy and live out her days in quiet obscurity. According to some accounts, Jean retreated to a remote castle on the Brittany coast devoting herself to prayer and good works in an effort to atone for her violent past. Other tales claim she simply vanished without a trace, her ultimate fate lost to history. Whatever the truth, there is no denying that Jean de Clesson lived a remarkable life, even by the turbulent standards of the Middle Ages, she was a woman who defied every convention of her time, a noblewoman who became a criminal, a wife who became a warrior, a mother who became a legend. In many ways, Jean's story embodies the strange contradictions of the medieval underworld, the blurring of lines between hero and villain, victim and perpetrator, justice and vengeance, in an age of stark brutality and rampant injustice, perhaps it's no wonder that some turn to crime as a means of asserting their humanity, of seizing some small measure of control over their destiny. As we contemplate these tales of daring outlaws and desperate cutthroats, it's tempting to romanticize their lives, to project our modern sensibilities onto their struggles, but we must remember that the reality of medieval crime was far bleaker than any ballad or legend would have us believe. For every flamboyant bandit king or pirate queen, there were countless anonymous wretches who lived and died in squalor, their brief, miserable lives snuffed out by disease, starvation, or the noose. The vast majority of medieval criminals were not dashing rogues or defiant rebels, but broken souls ground down by poverty, ignorance, and cruelty. And yet, even in the darkest corners of the medieval underworld, there are glimmers of something etchingly human, moments of courage, compassion, and even gallows humor in the face of unimaginable adversity. These were people who, for all their flaws and failings, fought tooth and nail to carve out some small space for themselves in a world that had no place for them. As we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for these long lost souls, the peasant thieves and vagabond rogues, the highwaymen and cutpursers, the smugglers and pirates, and all the other forgotten outlaws of the Middle Ages, May their restless spirits find some measure of peace in the silence of the grave, and may their stories endure as a testament to the indomitable human will to survive, even in the darkest of times, So we come to the end of our journey through the shadowy underbelly of medieval Europe, from the blood-soaked fields of England to the storm-tossed coasts of Brittany, We have followed in the footsteps of those who lived and died outside the law, those who dared to defy the harsh dictates of their time. It has been a grim and harrowing tale, a catalogue of cruelty, desperation and violence that speaks to the darkest impulses of the human heart. But it is also a profoundly human story, one that resonates across the centuries and reminds us of the common threads that bind us all. For in the end, are we not all outcasts in our own way? Are we not all struggling to find our place in a world that can seem cold, unfair, and indifferent to our suffering? The medieval criminal, for all his sins and sorrows, is a mirror held up to our own souls, a reminder of our shared frailty and our shared strength. So let us not judge them too harshly, these lost and lawless souls of ages past, let us instead remember them with empathy and understanding, as fellow travellers on the winding road of life. And let us take comfort in the knowledge that, no matter how dark the night may seem, the dawn will always come, bringing with it the promise of a new day and a chance to start anew. Rest now, weary traveller, and let the echoes of history lull you into a deep and dreamless sleep, May you find solace in the knowledge that you are not alone, that your struggles and triumphs are woven into the great tapestry of human experience. And may you wake refreshed and renewed, ready to face the challenges of your own time with the same courage, resilience, and indomitable spirit that sustained our ancestors through the darkest of ages. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams. The outlaws of old bid you peace and rest until we meet again on the winding road of history. The highway robbery exploits of Jack Cornwall soon became the talk of every tavern and town square across England. Ballads were composed extolling Jack Cornwall's daring and cunning in outwitting the king's men. But fame is a fickle mistress for an outlaw. The more celebrated Jack became, the more relentlessly the authorities hunted him. In the summer of 1381, after a particularly audacious heist on a tax collector's carriage in Warwickshire, Jack's luck finally ran out. Betrayed by a member of his own gang, lured by the sizable bounty, the informant led the local sheriff and 24 armed men to Jack's forest hideout. After a brief but fierce struggle, Jack was captured and hauled in chains before the King's Justice in London to answer for his litany of crimes against crown and God. The judge, an ancient, shriveled man with a permanent scowl, was unmoved by Jack's roguish charm. In a severe voice, he sentenced the highwayman to a traitor's death, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered before a jeering crowd. On the morning of his execution, Jack was dragged from the squalid confines of Newgate Prison to the public gallows at Tyburn. A festive, bloodthirsty mood hung over the thousands of spectators, jostling for a better view of the gruesome spectacle. Vendors peddled meat pies and ale to the excited mob. As Jack was led up the scaffold steps, filthy and emaciated from weeks in the dungeon, he nonetheless flashed his trademark smirk. When the executioner fitted the noose around his neck, Jack quipped to the hooting crowd, "No man lives forever, I only regret I have but one life to give for my merry old England." At the signal, the trapdoor swung open, and Jack plummeted to the end of the rope with a sharp crack. After strangling for several minutes, his body was cut down, and while still alive, his entrails were pulled from his slit belly as he screamed in agony. Finally, the executioner hacked his body into 4 pieces with an axe, to be displayed above the city gates as a grim warning to other would-be outlaws. Jack Cornwall's grisly demise was a stark reminder of the merciless punishments awaiting those who dared defy the social order in medieval England. For both kings and commoners, public executions and tortures served as brutal entertainment as well as instruments of state terror. These spectacles unified the law, abiding against the lawless, and created a climate of fear that made defying authority all but unthinkable for most. Public pain and death were considered vital parts of the justice system, a deterrent to crime and a means of vengeance. Crowds would gather in a festival-like atmosphere to jeer and laugh as the condemned suffered agonizing torments before facing the ultimate penalty. For petty crimes like theft, branding was common. The accused would be held down as a red-hot iron was pressed into the flesh of their hand, face, or chest, leaving them permanently marked as a criminal. Repeat offenders could expect to lose a hand or a foot, rendering them social outcasts, unable to find honest work even if they wished to reform. More severe crimes called for even ghastlier sentences. Murderers, rapists, and heretics might be sentenced to death by burning at the stake. Tied to a post atop a pile of kindling in the town square, the executioner would set the wood ablaze. The victim would be slowly consumed by the flames, thrashing and shrieking until they succumbed to smoke and searing pain. Traitors to the crown, as Jack Cornwall experienced, faced the most diabolical fates of all, in addition to hanging, drawing, and quartering. Some were sentenced to be boiled alive in a cauldron of water, oil, or even molten lead. Their agonized screams would fill the air as their skin sloughed off and their organs cooked inside them. Such stomach-churning brutality may seem incomprehensible to modern sensibilities, but in a medieval world plagued by rampant crime, violence, and disorder, horrific public tortures served as a kind of social glue, they unified communities against a common threat and underscored the absolute power of the authorities. Of course, not all criminals were caught or punished, many of the most desperate and daring managed to elude justice, at least for a time. With those defiant words, Eustace Folville faced the gallows with the same boldness that had defined his life. As the noose was fitted and the crowd pressed close to witness the end of the notorious bandit, Eustace maintained his composure. Some say he smiled, others that he sang a snatch of a ballad as the trap was sprung. Whatever the truth, his death marked the end of an era for the people of Leicestershire and the surrounding shires, Yet Eustace's legend only grew after his execution. Ballads celebrating his exploits became part of the oral tradition, sung in smoky taverns and whispered by firesides. For generations, peasants and villagers would recount tales of the merry bandit, the outlaw who robbed the rich, defied corrupt authority, and gave succor to the poor, his chivalry and wit became the stuff of folklore, a symbol of resistance against the grinding oppression of the age. But, as with all such stories, the lines between fact and legend blurred. Was Eustace truly a noble, hearted rogue, or simply another desperate man driven to violence by hardship and injustice? History offers no certain answer. What endures is the power of his tale, a reminder that even in the darkest times, people find hope, humour, and a measure of dignity in the exploits of those who dare to defy the odds. So as you drift into sleep, let the story of Eustace Folville join the chorus of voices from the medieval underworld, outlaws and rebels, tricksters and martyrs, who, for all their flaws, carved their names into history's shadowy margins. Their stories live on, speaking to our shared longing for justice, freedom, and a world where courage and compassion still matter. Rest well, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with the gallant laughter of outlaws and the promise of better days to come. Wa for traitors and the most reviled of criminals. Jack Cornwall, battered and broken, met his end as so many outlaws did, publicly and painfully, his body dismembered and put on grim display as a warning to all who might dare follow in his footsteps. In death, as in life, he became both a symbol and a spectacle, the unwelcome mirror of a world that created him. Jack's story, like that of Eustace Folville before him, embodies the brutal realities and the stubbornly romantic ideals of the medieval outlaw. The legend of the daring highwayman, rebel, thief, folk hero, was as much a product of the age's desperation as its cruelty. In the muddy crossroads and shadowy forests, the powerless dreamed of vengeance and freedom, while the powerful sought to preserve order through terror. But the experiences of men like Eustace and Jack tell only part of the story. For women in the Middle Ages, the justice system could be even more cruel and unforgiving. Female outlaws and those accused of witchcraft, infanticide, or moral crimes faced punishments every bit as grisly, often compounded by the deep-seated misogyny of the courts. Women like Jean D. Clesson, who defied convention and wielded power outside the law, were rare exceptions. Most women who ran afoul of authority were crushed beneath the same merciless wheel that ground down their brothers, fathers, and husbands. As we have seen, the brutal realities of medieval crime and punishment were inseparable from the harsh social conditions of the time. Grinding poverty, unchecked disease, and a rigid class hierarchy pushed many to the margins, where outlawry was sometimes the only path to survival. Even petty offences could lead to horrific torture or a gruesome public death, as the ruling class sought to maintain order through a regime of fear. The highwayman became an enduring archetype, a desperate bandit lurking along lonely roads, ambushing travellers and defying the established order. Some were fallen nobles, disgraced knights, or impoverished peasants, united only by the fact that society had left them with little to lose. The ballads and tales that celebrated their exploits offered a kind of vicarious defiance for the poor and downtrodden, transforming brutality and desperation into legend and hope. Yet beneath the romance lies a darker truth. The vast majority of medieval outlaws were not gallant rebels but broken souls, shaped by suffering and driven to violence by a world that offered them no mercy. For every Eustace Folville or Jack Cornwall whose name has survived in song and story, there were countless others, petty thieves, cutpursers, and desperate women, who vanished into oblivion, their lives and deaths lost to history. Only those considered the most infamous enemies of the crown faced the fate that awaited Jack Cornwall. As the executioner honed his blades, and the cart rolled slowly toward the place of slaughter, Cornwall is said to have glanced at his captors with a wry smile, remarking, "I only ever claimed my portion of the world's riches, no differently than any noble or bishop. Perhaps in death, I'll find the fairness denied to me in life." Whether he truly spoke these words is lost to history, but in that final moment of ironic defiance, he embodied the essence of the medieval outlaw, unbowed by the oppressive rules of his age. With a final gesture, Jack entrusted his soul to God. As the horses surged forward and the axe fell, blood erupted and pain was swift. Thus ended the life of one of the Middle Ages' most storied highwaymen. His head was severed cleanly by the executioner and displayed atop London Bridge, while the remains of his body were scattered across the kingdom as a gruesome caution to others who might follow his path. Yet Jack's legend endured far longer than his dismembered corpse, his story continued to be told in inns and roadside taverns, celebrated as a folk hero cut down by the merciless ruling elite. In this telling, his death became a kind of tragic elevation, an everlasting reproach to the greedy lords and clergy who prospered at the expense of the poor. While Jack Cornwall's saga is one of the more vivid accounts in the history of medieval crime, it also highlights the grim fates awaiting those who fell afoul of the law in that era. The perils of highway robbery were rivaled only by the ferocity of the punishments imposed on the captured. Before the establishment of official police or prisons, justice was often brutal and primitive, intended to terrorize would-be criminals through public executions and torture. Throughout medieval Europe, executions and punishments were public spectacles staged in town squares and castle courtyards, where crowds clamored for blood and preachers thundered warnings of divine wrath. Executioners, with practiced efficiency, transformed wrongdoers into warnings for all, reinforcing the certainty of royal vengeance. Punishments ranged from the humiliating to the horrific. Lesser crimes such as poaching or drunkenness might earn time in the stocks or pillory, where the condemned were exposed to the mockery and abuse of the crowd, forced to endure throne refuse and verbal taunts for hours or days. More serious offences, like burglary or forgery, brought harsher penalties, public floggings that left backs lacerated and mutilations that saw ears or noses sliced off with cruel precision. Thieves and pickpockets were often branded with hot irons, forever marked as outcasts. Even these harsh penalties paled in comparison to the inventive cruelties reserved for the gravest offences: treason, heresy, witchcraft, and murder. For such crimes, medieval justice unleashed its most grisly and imaginative forms of torture and execution, designed to inflict maximum suffering and degradation on the accused. Medieval society devised a terrifying catalogue of punishments intended to inflict maximum pain and disgrace, before finally granting the condemned the mercy of death. Some, like Jack Cornwall, met a gruesome end by being drawn and quartered, tied to 4 horses straining in opposite directions until their bodies were torn apart, bones snapping and skin ripping in bloody shreds. Others endured branding with red, hot irons, their flesh sizzling and blistering as the searing metal made its mark. Many were broken on the wheel, their limbs shattered between wooden spokes, until they were left barely alive, a mangled heap of flesh and bone. Those accused of witchcraft or heresy often faced the stake, screaming as their bodies were consumed by fire, fat and skin burning in thick, greasy smoke. Perhaps most infamous of all was the sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering. A fate reserved for those who had gravely offended the crown or church. In this nightmarish ordeal, victims were first partially hanged, left gasping and convulsing, but still conscious, Next, a sharp knife would slice open their abdomen, spilling their entrails onto the scaffold, sometimes accompanied by further mutilation. The executioner would then swiftly behead the prisoner, finally ending their suffering in a torrent of blood and gore. Such horrifying spectacles were a common sight in the muddy, blood-stained courtyards of medieval Europe, designed to instill terror in all who might contemplate defying the harsh laws of the time. Life was already short and brutal for most, and these public executions served as a chilling promise of even greater torments for those daring to rebel. Yet, even amid this backdrop of savagery, certain figures managed to rise above mere infamy to achieve a rebellious kind of fame. These were the legendary outlaws and so-called gentlemen thieves, celebrated for stealing from the rich and, at least in legend, helping the poor. Their daring deeds were immortalized in folk songs and stories, their memories living on long after the executioner's blade had claimed them, Such men bridged the line between criminal and folk hero, offering the masses a fantasy of defiance against the rigid oppression of feudal life. Among the most renowned of these was Eustace Folville, a bold highwayman and the scourge of 14th century Leicestershire. Born the youngest son of a reputable rural family, Eustace seemed destined for an ordinary life of farming and family duty, but a restless spirit and a taste for excitement led him to abandon home and hearth, seeking his fortune along England's highways. With charm and wit, Eustace assembled a group of fellow outcasts, poachers, deserters, and runaway peasants. Dressed in Lincoln green and armed with bows and swords, Folville's band haunted the forests of the Midlands, ambushing wealthy merchants and tax collectors while sparing the poor. As tales of their exploits spread, Eustace and his men became heroes to the oppressed peasantry, stories told of an audacious bandit who defied the region's lords and bishops, robbing the powerful and sometimes sharing with the needy. Ballads sang of Folville's uncanny ability to evade capture, outwitting the bumbling sheriff time and again. The downtrodden admired a leader who not only frustrated the rich, but did so with style and bravado, eyes glinting and mustaches twirled beneath his jaunty hood. But in time, even the luckiest outlaw could not escape the tightening grip of royal justice, after one bold heist too many, most notably the theft of the abbot of Leicester's golden candlesticks, Folville's gang finally drew the wrath of the crown itself, the king dispatched a hand-picked force of knights and trackers, determined to stamp out the outlaw threat once and for all, Eustace and his companions made a valiant last stand among the thick oaks of Charwood Forest, arrows flying and swords gleaming through the dappled sunlight, but even their legendary skill could not overcome the overwhelming odds. Bleeding and beaten, Eustace was ultimately hauled in chains before the furious abbot to face royal justice. A notorious highwayman whose rebellious spirit was deemed too dangerous to be left alive, Yet even at the foot of the gallows, Folville's spirit remained unbroken. With a roguish grin and a flash of bravado, he is said to have declared, "My only regret is that I have but one neck to lose for the poor of this land." Such fearless defiance in the face of certain death only magnified his legend, casting him as a rakish rebel who mocked authority even at the end. In the aftermath of his execution, the monarchy cracked down fiercely on banditry, filling the countryside with gibbets and dungeons in an effort to quash any further uprising. Yet Eustace Folville's legend proved impossible to extinguish. For generations, Peasants would spin tales of his exploits over tankards of oil, painting him as a heroic figure, a bold avenger of the forests, struck down by the greed and cruelty of the powerful, as in both death and life, Eustace had slipped beyond the grasp of earthly rulers, living on as a symbol of resistance in popular memory, while figures like Fulville inspired romantic visions of resistance, the harsh reality for most medieval offenders was far bleaker, particularly for women, not as in a society where women were regarded as little more than property, the legal system reserved its most vicious punishments for those who defied their prescribed roles, where a man might receive a brief stint in the stocks for a minor offense, a woman could be brutally whipped or permanently scarred as women, labeled as scolds, or gossips were condemned as nuisances and subjected to the humiliating torture of the scold's bridle, a spiked iron cage locked around the head, with a jagged bit forced into the mouth to silence the offending tongue. These unfortunate women were paraded through the streets as spectacles, intended as warnings to others who might disrupt the peace with their words. More serious accusations brought even crueler punishments, female thieves or prostitutes might have their noses or ears sliced off, a lasting badge of shame to mark them forever. Unmarried mothers faced savage beatings and imprisonment in bleak asylums, forced to labor endlessly in hopes of redeeming themselves. But of all the charges a woman could face, none brought more frenzied persecution than the accusation of witchcraft, in a world plagued by disease and disaster, and always fearful of the devil's presence, women living alone, midwives, healers, widows, were easy targets for suspicion. Once accused, there was little hope for mercy. The supposed witch would be stripped and shaved, her body poked and prodded for the devil's mark. Any birthmark or blemish seized as proof of her pact with evil, torture, followed in stretching on the rack, crushing beneath stones, until most would confess to any crime just to end their suffering, spinning tales of midnight rituals and devilish encounters, for those who still refused to admit guilt, the only fate left was to be burned alive. All across Europe, tens of thousands of women were tied to stakes and set ablaze, their bodies reduced to ash as crowds cheered the supposed destruction of evil. In the fevered imaginations of celibate priests and paranoid inquisitors, the witch embodied the ultimate nightmare of unrestrained female sexuality, a seductive agent of the devil, threatening to emasculate and unnerve her holy accusers, such was the grim fate awaiting any woman who dared defy the crushing patriarchy of medieval Europe. Whether driven by hardship, passion, or a simple longing to live outside the narrow confines of marriage and motherhood, women who strayed too far from society's expectations faced merciless retribution from both church and crown, their suffering stood as a stark testament to the relentless misogyny that permeated even the most enlightened corners of the age. Yet not all scandal was confined to society's outcasts, even the most revered institutions were tainted by the same greed, lust, and abuse that plagued the feudal world. In fact, the late Middle Ages witnessed the Catholic Church's once untouchable reputation increasingly undermined by widespread corruption and moral decay within its ranks, rather than serving as shepherds to their flocks, many clerics seemed to emulate the money changers Jesus cast from the temple. Bishops and cardinals grew fat on the profits of selling church offices and privileges to the highest bidder, as we've seen, the suffocating inequality and hardship of medieval life drove many to the margins and into crime. With no professional police force and only sporadic patrols, the roads of Europe were prowled by bandits and highwaymen, preying on the vulnerable. Jack Cornwall was one such figure, a 14th-century English farmer raised in poverty, often going hungry as a child in his crumbling cottage. As a young man, he worked tirelessly on his lord's lands, earning barely enough to feed his family. After several failed harvests and harsh winters, left his loved ones near starvation, desperation pushed Jack onto the outlaw's path. At first, he was terrified as he lurked in the woods robbing travelers at knife point. But Jack quickly discovered a knack for the trade relying on his quick wit and silver tongue to relieve wealthy merchants and arrogant nobles of their purses without bloodshed. His reputation as a gentleman thief grew attracting other men driven to the brink by poverty. Together, they became notorious, striking swiftly and disappearing into the greenwood before the authorities could respond But Jack's notoriety made him a marked man. Humiliated by repeated failures to catch the elusive outlaw, the local sheriff placed a heavy bounty on his head. One autumn night, as Jack and his gang reveled in a lonely tavern, the sheriff's soldiers burst in. Outnumbered, Jack was captured after a fierce fight and dragged off to the dungeons where he was brutally tortured for the whereabouts of his hidden spoils. Bloodied yet unbroken, Jack faced the magistrate with a wry smile and reportedly quipped "My only regret is that I have but one neck for my starving companions." Unimpressed, the judge condemned him to a grisly public execution. Before a jeering crowd, Jack was hanged, drawn and quartered. His head mounted above the gates as a chilling warning to any who might follow in his footsteps. Such savage punishments were commonplace in the Middle Ages an era where justice was often meted out with horrific violence. Authorities believed only the most brutal tortures and degrading public spectacles could deter desperate people from crime. For minor theft, a person might be flogged until their back was raw, or have a hand chopped off as an enduring mark of disgrace. Those who blasphemed could lose their tongues while spies might have their eyes gouged out. The gravest offences inspired even more fiendish cruelty. Murderers and rebels were hung in iron cages, left to rot as crows pecked at their remains. Heretics and witches were burned alive, their cries mingling with the prayers and jeers of the crowd. Traitors endured the horrific ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Strung up cut down still alive, disemboweled, beheaded, and finally hacked into pieces. Perhaps the most terrifying fate awaited those cast into the dungeon. A lightless, stinking pit beneath a castle, where prisoners awaited their doom. Imagine the horror of being dragged into that fetid cell, shackled to damp stone walls, forgotten by all but the rats and the pitiless jailers. The stench of filth and fear would choke every breath as you listened to the dying moans of fellow captives, many of whom would perish from disease, torture, or despair before ever reaching the scaffold. In some castles, visitors can still descend into these medieval dungeons today, if they have the nerve. The chill and gloom seem to echo centuries of suffering, with tally marks scratched onto the walls and fragments of desperate prayers carved by those who waited in vain for freedom. Sometimes, amidst the despair of medieval dungeons, prisoners scrawled jokes or dark humor on the walls, a kind of gallows wit. One of the most remarkable such records was left by Robert of Alton, who, while awaiting execution for murder in the 1290s, composed an entire autobiography in his cell. Once a minor noble and renowned juster, Robert's descent began when he killed a man in a drunken tavern fight. Though he managed to flee he soon found that the lawless life suited him. He rampaged across England for months, robbing and killing without mercy. Eventually, after a bloody confrontation with the sheriff's men left him wounded and delirious, Robert was captured. Facing an imminent and gruesome death he filled his lonely hours in the dungeon by recording his life story on scraps of mouldy parchment. In his writings, he tries to explain away his crimes casting himself as a victim of fate, betrayed by women, slighted by fellow knights, crushed by debts that drove him to desperation. At times, his memoir reads like the self-pitying grievances of an unrepentant narcissist, but as his execution draws near, Robert's bravado begins to crumble. He writes with regret and horror about the suffering he's caused, the lives he's destroyed, and the darkness that has overtaken him. In his final pages, he confesses his longing for redemption as a begging for God's forgiveness and hoping that his fate might deter other angry young men from making the same mistakes as a. His story is a chilling reflection on how easily the line can blur between outlaw and hero, or monster and man. Not all those who ran afoul of medieval justice were murderous outlaws, as a. The era offered scant rights or protections, especially for women and the lower classes. A peasant girl could be whipped simply for fornication, as a, while a noblewoman who killed her abusive husband might be burned alive for petty treason. Speaking out against the all-powerful church could see you branded a heretic and tortured until you recanted, as a. Even those within the church were not immune from vice and scandal. In 1390, London was rocked by revelations from a surprise inspection at St. Anne's Abbey, as a. Where monks were found drinking and consorting with prostitutes. The abbot and his clergy had been running a brothel from the monastery for years, enriching themselves while preaching chastity as a. Such flagrant hypocrisy was hardly rare. Unchecked religious authority often bred corruption. Some men of the cloth strayed even further as a. The infamous ex-monk Honorius of Autun spent the 180s roaming the French countryside, seducing and swindling widows out of their fortunes. When charm failed, as a. He turned to poisons and sorcery to ensnare his victims. After 2 decades, Honorius was finally unmasked as a practitioner of black magic and burned at the stake for heresy. Yet, as a. For all the grim tales of crime and punishment, no figures have captured the imagination quite like the gallant highwaymen and legendary outlaws, as a. Names like Eustace Fulville, the gentleman robber of 14th century Leicester, became the stuff of folklore. Eustace, a minor noble whose inheritance was stolen by scheming rivals, as a. Refused to let his family's honor fade into obscurity. Instead, he gathered loyal companions and began ambushing tax collectors and wealthy travelers. But Eustace was no common brigand, as a. He styled himself a champion of the poor, robbing the rich to aid the needy. After successful raids, he was said to host generous feasts in the forest for starving villagers, as a. His charisma and daring earned him the devotion of the common folk, who sheltered him from the law. Ballads and poems soon celebrated his exploits as a. Depicting Eustace as a clever trickster, disguising himself as a leper, a friar, or even a maiden to slip past pursuers. Some stories went so far as to credit him with matchmaking as a. Using his plundered wealth to help penniless brides and unite lovers. Of course, the actual tale was likely far less romantic. Eustace and his men left a bloody trail across the countryside. In truth, as a. Eustace Fulville and his band left a trail of violence throughout the Midlands, and their actions were rarely as noble or as targeted as the old ballads suggest, as a. Yet in an era rife with unchecked corruption and greed, it's little wonder that ordinary people sought their champions among the ranks of outlaws. The daring rogues, desperate peasants, as a. Corrupt priests, and remorseful killers of the Middle Ages may be dust now, their bones lost in unmarked graves, but their tales still resonate across the centuries. They're brutal as a. Often tragic lives offer a window into a world with scant mercy for the powerless, where a minor transgression could bring disaster, and even the smallest crime was punished with savage severity as a. Yet, within even the darkest figures, we find glimmers of common humanity. The everyman driven to desperation by a callous society, the rebel who dreams of justice as a. The sinner who clings to hope for redemption at the end. While we might recoil from their cruelest acts, there's an undeniable resonance in their flaws, regrets, and longings as a. Perhaps what truly captivates us about these ancient criminals is the reflection they cast upon our own world. How much really has changed since those days when the poor were forced into crime as a. The powerful escaped accountability, and a person's fate was determined by birth and circumstance. Maybe our fascination is tinged with the uneasy recognition that, but for the luck of history, we too could have languished in those fetid dungeons, our own mistakes etched into cold stone. Yet as we settle into our comfortable beds, the soft glow of modern life pushing back the darkness, we can feel grateful that those cruel days are behind us, a grim chapter from which, thankfully, we have awakened. The outlaws and cutthroats of the past have faded into memory their grisly ends a cautionary tale in a kinder, more just world. Today, justice is tempered with compassion, and even the lowest among us can hope for dignity and mercy So let us pause for a moment's quiet reflection on those less fortunate souls born into harsher times, when life was truly nasty, brutish, and short But let us also take comfort in the progress we've made and the better angels of our nature that light our path forward. With that, I bid you good night and peaceful dreams, secure in the knowledge that the horrors of history are but shadows behind us, overtaken by the promise of a brighter day, As the sun dipped behind the thatched rooftops and winding lanes of medieval England, shadows crept across the fields where the porous peasants fought daily just to survive, let alone avoid the law's harsh hand. For many, desperate times called for desperate acts. Among them was Jack Cornwall, a humble turnip farmer from the bleak moors of Devon. Jack had always been an honest man, content to work his rocky plot and provide for his family as best he could. But everything changed in the summer of 1352. That year, the rains never came, and Jack's crops shriveled in the parched earth. His infant son succumbed to a fever, fading before his helpless eyes. When Jack couldn't pay the yearly tithe to the local monastery, the abbot's men torched his barn as punishment, his last skinny ox trapped inside. With ruin and starvation closing in, something within Jack finally broke. Jack Cornwall, pushed beyond the limits of endurance, turned to the lonely roads with nothing but a sturdy oak staff and a fierce resolve to reclaim what he felt had been stolen from him. Under the ghostly light of the moon, he concealed himself by the wayside, his lean frame shrouded in a tattered black hood. At first, Jack targeted lone travelers, demanding their coins and trinkets, his features hidden, his voice trembling with nervous excitement. But as his nerve grew, so too did his ambitions. Before long, he was bold enough to rob entire merchant convoys, making off with wagons brimming with goods. It wasn't long before rumors began to swell through Devon. People spoke in hushed voices of a shadowy figure stalking the moors. A hooded demon, they called him. Some insisted he could vanish into thin air or had bargained his soul to the devil for unnatural abilities. Others whispered that he commanded a legion of vagabonds, a small army of outcasts preying on the wealthy across the Shire. The truth was far less dramatic, but Jack made no effort to quash the tales. In fact, his growing reputation for menace and mystery only made his work easier, as terrified victims offered little resistance. For a time, the hooded demon's midnight raids became part of local legend as a regular terror for the privileged. But luck, as ever, is a fickle ally. One cold November night, Jack lay in wait for a lavish carriage making its way down a forested path, convinced its noble occupant would be heavy with gold. As he sprang from the shadows, brandishing a battered blade, he was met not with fear, but with the unmistakable ring of swords drawn all around him, it had been an elaborate trap. The carriage sped off untouched as a squad of the sheriff's men poured from the trees, overwhelming Jack before he could utter a word, they slammed him face first into the icy mud, locking his wrists in iron. News of the legendary highwayman's capture spread like wildfire. In every alehouse and by every hearth, people debated the real identity of the hooded demon and wondered aloud about the grisly fate that surely awaited him. Most assumed he'd swing from the gallows before the week was out, but the sheriff sought a more public, agonizing punishment, a dire warning to any who might dream of defying the law. Jack was sentenced to gibbeted at a busy crossroads, locked in an iron cage and left to perish from exposure, his body picked apart by carrion birds for all to see. Jack's trial was little more than a spectacle. Still battered from his capture, he was hauled before the bailiff in chains, the crowd pelting him with rotten vegetables and insults, the sheriff recited a long list of charges: robbery, assault, blasphemy, even witchcraft and treason. Jack tried to defend himself, insisting he'd been driven to crime by misfortune and hunger, not malice. But the court was unmoved. When the bailiff asked if anyone would stand for the prisoner, only silence replied. Before him lay a table piled high with the treasures he'd stolen, proof enough for the court that Jack Cornwall's fate was sealed. Jack Cornwall had no defense to offer, and the notorious outlaw could only lower his head in defeat as the bailiff pronounced him guilty on every count. The sentencing death by gibbet, to be carried out at first light, The crowd exploded with raucous cheers, jeering as Jack was hauled from the courthouse, wrists tied behind his back. He stumbled through the filthy lanes, children darting out to pelt him with refuse and rotten fruit, braying with laughter at his disgrace. Soon the ominous silhouette of the gallows loomed ahead, its iron cages creaking in the morning wind, a hush fell over the crowd as Jack was led forward, even the most bloodthirsty among them sobered by the grim spectacle. As he mounted the splintered scaffold in the misty pre-dawn, Jack's gaunt face seemed almost ghostly, as if he were already halfway to the world beyond, The sheriff's men had to hoist his limp frame into the cramped gibbet that hung from the gallows crossbeam. As the bailiff recited the official sentence, Jack forced himself to look up one final time. Before him stood the faces of the town, some twisted with satisfaction, others with discomfort or curiosity, He recognized the same haggard women and stooped old men he'd once seen begging in the streets, the same desperate people whose struggles he knew all too well. For once, he had been one of them. Now, he was their spectacle, the warning dangled above the mud. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped him at the irony of it all. He had fought back against a world that cared nothing for men like him, but in the end, it had only crushed him harder. As the iron door clanged shut, sealing him inside his final prison, Jack felt no more anger, just a tired acceptance, His head lolled against the cold bars, eyes fluttering closed as the bailiff's final words rang out. He shall be left here to perish and rot, as a warning to all thieves and enemies of the king's peace. May God have mercy on his soul. The crowd lingered for a while, murmuring and craning their necks to see if the condemned man would react, but Jack was still as a broken puppet, the faint movement of his breath the only sign of life. Slowly, the townsfolk drifted away, the thrill of justice already fading from their minds. Children's laughter soon echoed through the damp streets, the baker's oven blazed to life, and the scent of fresh bread began to fill the air. On the lonely hill, Jack Cornwall, the once feared hooded demon, remained caged and shivering, staring out through dull, lifeless eyes at a world that had finally defeated him. The memories of his former life slipped away like morning mist, leaving behind only the shattered remnant of an outlaw, suspended in iron as though awaiting the cold mercy of death. Jack Cornwall's ordeal in the public square dragged on for 3 long, harrowing days and nights. The sky unleashed a relentless, freezing rain as he curled up, trembling against the biting cold, his tattered clothes offering no protection from the chill. Hunger gnawed at him, thirst burned in his throat, and every hour seemed to sap more of his strength, gaunt-faced street children gathered below his prison, shouting insults and daring each other to prod his skeletal limbs with sticks, gleefully calling him demon, demon! Their laughter mixed with the snarls of stray dogs who barked and snapped at his feet, baring their teeth. Through it all, Jack could do little more than groan weakly from his cage, his eyes sunken and unfocused. Sometimes feverish delirium took hold, and he muttered incoherently at the cawing ravens circling above. Death would have been a mercy, but even at his lowest, covered in filth and barely conscious, Jack stubbornly clung to life. The last spark of defiance smouldering within him, unwilling to grant his tormentors the satisfaction of seeing him break. As time dragged on, the grim spectacle lost its appeal. The children wandered off, and even the bailiff grew bored of guarding a solitary, broken outlaw hanging in the gibbet. By the dawn of the fourth day, no one spared him a glance as they passed beneath the gallows' shadow. When Jack Cornwall's end finally arrived, only the cold wind and a single raven watched as he gave a final, rattling breath, leaving his earthly suffering behind. He hung there, stiff and lifeless, until the bailiff's men eventually cut him down and buried his body in an unmarked grave at the crossroads. Jack Cornwall's tale was not unusual for his time. Many desperate men turned to the roads out of poverty or greed, and public executions were a familiar, grim event in towns across the land. Yet, something about the fate of the hooded demon left a lasting impression on those who witnessed it. In the years that followed, children dared each other to visit his burial place after dark, and travelers quickened their pace, whispering prayers as they passed the old gallows. Jack's story, one of suffering and stubborn resistance, was retold in taverns and around hearths, becoming part of local legend. For the poor and downtrodden, Jack Cornwall became a strange sort of folk herog, a symbol of vengeance from beyond the grave, haunting the powerful who had condemned him. Though his rebellion was doomed, people still raised their cups in his memory and sang mournful ballads about the highwayman of Devon, even as they hoped their own fates would not mirror his. And so, on cold nights, the legend of Jack Cornwall endured, whispered for generations as both a warning and a tribute. On November nights, when dry leaves scuttle across the ground like skeletal fingers, raking naked branches, some still glance nervously over their shoulders as they hurry through the darkness. Many swear they've glimpsed a tattered black hood lurking at the crossroads, poised to ambush the unwary. Yet in truth, Jack Cornwall is long gone. Only a few brittle bones rot beneath the mossy gallows hill. He was a man like any other, crushed by the relentless machinery of his era, his short, violent tale echoing those of countless forgotten souls. Paupers doomed by fortune, dying as outlaws, unlamented and erased by time. Welcome back, dear listener, as we descend once more into the grim world of medieval justice and lawlessness. Our journey now takes us into the reeking lanes and shadowy taverns where the most notorious of society's outcasts gather. Imagine, if you will, a smoky, ramshackle inn on the edges of 14th century London. The air hangs heavy with the odours of sweat, sour ale, and bubbling stew of questionable contents. In a shadowed corner, a rough-hewn table is crowded with men whose faces are hidden beneath hoods, voices low and furtive in the flicker of candlelight. These are the infamous Folville brothers and their band, a group of noble-born outlaws who chose the path of crime. At their head sits Eustace Folville, tall and sharp-eyed, wrapped in a costly cloak, his boots polished and his gaze keen. Though born to privilege and comfort, Eustace's restless spirit and deep sense of injustice drove him to become an outlaw. Raising a mug of mead, Eustace regales his companions with their latest caper. "That bloated tax man never saw us coming," he says with a rakish grin, and his purse was stuffed like a Christmas goose. The men laugh and knock their mugs together in celebration. In an age rife with corruption, Eustace styled himself a defender of the poor, he and his crew would ambush rich officials and travelling merchants on lonely roads, but unlike most thieves, he insisted on sharing the loot with the needy villagers. "You should have seen their faces," chuckles a grimy companion, like St. Nicholas himself had arrived. To the authorities, of course, the Folville gang were dangerous criminals, with generous rewards on their heads. But Eustace's wit and the goodwill of the locals kept him just out of reach of the law, their escapades soon became legend, retold in songs and stories of their bold robberies and Eustace's unmatched archery. One tale claims that when cornered by the sheriff's men in a tree, Eustace leaped onto his horse below and dashed away, laughing all the while. Yet for all the romance, the life of an outlaw was perilous. Skirmishes with soldiers, desperate escapes, and the ever-present risk of betrayal were their daily reality. And if ever caught, they faced a grisly and very public fate. Execution was the inevitable end for those captured, their names forever inscribed in history as infamous villains. As the evening in the tavern draws to a close, Eustace and his band melt into the foggy darkness, plotting their next daring exploit. Little did they realize their celebrated spree had only months left before a final, fateful confrontation with the sheriff's men. But that, dear listener, is a chilling story for another night, For now, let us pause and contemplate the legacy of the Folville gang, their controversial deeds shed light on the Robin Hood, like figures who emerged in times of hardship and injustice. Men like Eustace, revered as champions by some, condemned as criminals by others, and perhaps embodying both roles at once. Centuries later, their legends still captivate us, offering a glimpse into the tangled web of medieval society, But as the night deepens and the candle's flame flickers low, rest your tired mind and let images of misty woods and bold outlaws slip quietly into dreams. When next we meet, we'll turn our attention to the harsh destinies faced by women accused of crime in the Middle Ages and the scandalous sagas of rebellious nuns. Until then, good night and peaceful sleep, Let's continue our immersive exploration of crime and punishment in medieval Europe, transitioning from the tumultuous backdrop that gave rise to so much lawlessness we now delve into the life of one of the era's most feared highwaymen, Jack Cornwall. Jack Cornwall, whose name haunted travellers' dreams, was born to humble beginnings. The son of a struggling farmer in famine ravaged 14th century England. For a while, his future seemed bright. But tragedy struck when both parents succumbed to disease, leaving Jack an orphan at just 15, penniless and utterly alone. Homeless and desperate, he wandered from village to village, seeking work and a scrap of bread, Yet, with the countryside swollen with hungry vagabonds, there was little charity to be found, and even fewer honest means of survival. Driven to desperation, Jack began with small thefts, pilfering food from market stalls and raiding unattended pantries. His crimes soon escalated, poaching game from the local lord's forests, Inevitably, his luck ran out. Caught with a pair of stolen hares, the destitute youth found himself dragged before the bailiff's court. With nothing to offer but a plea for mercy, Jack faced a brutal choice from the sneering magistrate. Lose a hand or join the bloody war raging in France. Jack, weighing two equally grim paths, choose the one that at least offered a chance of survival. Jack shouldered a sword and marched away, just another expendable foot soldier in a distant war. For 6 grueling years, he slogged through fields of mud and the stench of sickness, watching friends fall to arrows and pestilence alike. Somehow he endured, his body battered, his spirit eroded, but alive, When he finally staggered back to England, he found no welcome, only empty bellies and colder hearts. The nation he had fought for turned its back on him, there was no place for a broken veteran except among beggars and thieves. So Jack slipped back into vagrancy and petty theft, scraping by in a world that wanted nothing of him, Given the harshness of his youth and the cruelty of his times, perhaps it was always inevitable that he would turn outlaw. Some would insist Jack had been born wicked, bound for a bad end, But who among us can claim to know the limits of suffering, or predict what hunger and despair might drive us to do? What is certain is that by the spring of 1354, as the hedgerows along the old Roman roads burst into green, Jack Cornwall had become someone new. No longer a desperate youth begging for scraps, he was now a seasoned predator. Clad in battered leathers, a longbow slung across his back, and a keen blade at his belt, when wealthy merchants or arrogant nobles trotted down the road atop their fine horses, Jack would step from the shadows, arrow nocked and eyes hard as granite, those who paid his toll were allowed to pass, lighter in purse and pride. Those who resisted soon felt the sting of his arrows. For nearly 3 years, Jack Cornwall haunted the lonely lanes of Wessex, his reign marked by ambush and plunder. He amassed a trove of gold and gems, squandered as quickly as it was won on drink, dice, and fleeting company in nameless taverns where no questions were asked, in those smoky halls, Jack's generosity and his defiance became the stuff of legend, painting him as a charming rogue who thumbed his nose at the rich. But Jack was playing a dangerous game, when a bishop was stripped of a chest full of church tithes, the authorities' patience snapped. They flooded the countryside with wanted posters, promising a king's ransom for the outlaw's capture, soon, informants crawled out of every tavern and hovel, eager to trade allegiance for coin. One starless night, as Jack slept off his revels in a shabby inn, the sheriff's men burst through the door and dragged him away in irons. Before a hastily assembled court, Jack faced a row of unsympathetic magistrates who cared nothing for his mumbled pleas, their verdict was swift and unforgiving guilty, and condemned to hang at dawn. Yet, for all their haste, the authorities failed to snuff out Jack's legend. The people, hardened by years of hardship, were hungry for stories of someone who had dared to strike back at the privileged. When Jack Cornwall finally swung from the gallows, a raucous crowd watched. Not in condemnation, but in celebration, for a fleeting moment, he was more than a criminal. He was a folk hero, a symbol of rebellion who had, however briefly, turned the world on its head. In all its sordid detail, Jack Cornwall's story is a stark reminder of how razor-thin the boundary once was between desperate hunger and outright criminality during eras of crushing inequality. For every dashing outlaw immortalized in song, there were countless nameless pickpockets and brigands, most condemned to short, brutal lives in the margins of society, their stories lost to time. The grim realities awaiting most lawbreakers in the Middle Ages could easily outdo the most chilling tales modern true crime has to offer, before the advent of organized police or proper jails, authorities relied on a gruesome arsenal of public punishments to terrify the populace into obedience. Among the most infamous was the practice of gibbeting the condemned. Typically those most despised by society would be locked in a metal cage and hoisted high upon a post at a busy crossroads, left to die slowly from thirst, exposure, and madness. Crows would peck at their decaying flesh, their tortured cries echoing across the fields as a dire warning to others who might dare defy the king's law, But gibbeting was only one of many nightmarish fates that could befall offenders in those lawless times. Petty thieves might be clamped into the stocks in a bustling square, their heads and hands trapped in wood as jeering crowds pelted them with refuse and stones. Not women accused of adultery could face the biting sting of the lash or be forced to parade through the streets in coarse, humiliating garments, heretics and blasphemers met even crueler ends, having their tongues ripped out or their flesh branded with red-hot irons, Yet among all these cruel and unusual punishments, perhaps none inspire such morbid fascination as the dungeons hidden beneath the grand castles of Europe. Far below the sunlit halls, these fetid, airless pits served as living tombs for those the authorities wished to forget. Imagine being hauled down a winding, torch-lit staircase and thrown into a windowless stone cell with nothing but a mound of filthy straw and a bucket for company. The door slams shut, plunging you into pitch blackness, the stagnant air reeks of sweat, rot, and despair, The only visitor is a surly gaoler who occasionally shoves a crust of mouldy bread through a slot, just enough to keep you alive as your teeth loosen and your body wastes away. Some prisoners, shackled with iron weights, could languish for years, awaiting the grisly fate reserved for traitors to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. For most, the only escape was a slow, agonizing death by starvation, disease, or torture. Yet even in these hellish depths, the resilience of the human spirit sometimes surfaced, in the Tower of London, perhaps the most notorious dungeon of all. Centuries of captives passed the endless, maddening hours scratching messages and crude drawings into the walls these fragments, simple prayers, desperate jokes, or names carved in trembling hands, bear witness to the fears and hopes of souls abandoned by the world. One of the most haunting messages, etched in shaky letters during the religious persecutions of the 16th century, reads simply, "Lord help me, for I am helpless." Such words linger through the ages as a testament to the suffering and quiet courage of those condemned to darkness, reminding us of a time when justice was as cruel as it was public, and survival itself was a daily act of defiance. We can only begin to fathom the courage and hopelessness behind that desperate plea, etched by someone lost in the darkness, its echo a chilling reminder of the suffering humans have inflicted upon one another in the name of king and faith. Not all the enemies of the crown wasted away in filth and obscurity, though, some legendary outlaws flourished, if only for a time, openly mocking the law and captivating the masses with their daring deeds and rebellious spirit, these bold men and women moved in a twilight world of danger and romance, a realm that continues to shape our modern imagination of the medieval age. Take, for instance, the tale of Eustace Fulville, a 14th century nobleman who transformed himself from landed knight to infamous outlaw chief. Eustace's early years suggested a future of privilege and respectability, hunting in green forests, hawking on the moors, and presiding over the family manor. But fate took a dark turn after his hot-blooded older brother killed a neighboring squire in a fit of rage. Branded as criminals, the Fulville family was forced to flee, condemned to a life on the run in the tangled woods of Leicestershire. Yet, unlike ragged bandits lurking in the shadows, Eustace and his brothers embraced their criminal calling with all the arrogance and flair of their noble upbringing. Dressed in fine linens and mounted on swift horses, the Fulville gang ambushed royal officials as they crisscrossed the Midlands, their saddlebags heavy with tax silver squeezed from struggling peasants, with a bold call of "Stand and deliver," the masked highwayman would rob these functionaries at sword point, then vanish into the forest, leaving only jeering laughter behind, popular rumour, spread in both grand manor halls and smoky village taverns, insisted that the Fulvilles kept none of their spoils, instead distributing their loot among the needy, whether fact or cunning legend. This tale won them the adoration of the poor and the fury of the authorities. In the shires where they hunted, it was whispered that villagers would seek out the Fulville hideouts, bearing gifts of wine, food, and news of wealthy targets. Ballads celebrated Eustace's audacity and cleverness, painting him as a dashing rogue in an age of greed and hardship. But even the most adored outlaws can run out of luck. Eustace learned this truth one bleak autumn day in 1326, betrayed by a local informant while sheltering in a wayside inn. Suddenly, a detachment of the king's men descended, eager for both glory and the hefty reward on his head. What followed was a wild pursuit, Eustace darting down rural lanes and winding back roads across the Midlands, his story teetering on the edge between legend and grim reality. With the relentless sheriff and his posse hard on his trail, Eustace Fulville's loyal companions fell one by one, brought down by a hail of arrows or cornered and chained. At last, only Eustace remained, urging his exhausted horse through the tangled lanes, desperation driving him forward. Ultimately, it was his own daring that led to his downfall, in a final gambit to shake his purses, Eustace veered off the main road and plunged into a thicket, only for his horse to stumble blindly into a hidden ravine. Pinned beneath the flailing animal, the infamous outlaw could do little but watch as the sheriff's men crashed through the undergrowth, weapons drawn, faces grim with triumph. Legend has it that Eustace, ever the irrepressible rogue, managed a quip as they dragged him to his feet and bound his hands for the gallows. "Gentlemen, I beg you, treat me kindly," he supposedly joked, "It's not every day a man gets to dance at his own hanging." Some even whispered he kicked out a Johnny tune on the way to the scaffold. Yet, beneath the bravado, Eustace's final moments were almost certainly far grimmer than the ballads admit. However he faced his end, defiant or pleading, his fate was sealed the instant the noose tightened around his neck, so ended Eustace Folville, the genteel pickpocket whose legend outlived his flesh and bone. For a brief, dazzling moment, not he became a symbol of rebellion against the corrupt powers that crushed ordinary people beneath their gilded heels. That his story survived for centuries in popular memory speaks not only to his flair, but also to the deep human longing for a champion. Someone willing to strike back at oppression, no matter how hopeless the fight. Perhaps in some small way, Eustace lives on in all who dare to laugh in the face of ruin, but woe betide any woman who tried to follow in Eustace's footsteps, in those merciless times, the law and the church viewed women as frail, easily corrupted, and particularly susceptible to the devil's snares, Consider the plight of a desperate girl forced by hunger into prostitution. In most towns, brothels paid regular bribes to operate under the authorities' wary eyes, but any woman caught selling her body without official sanction faced a savage public whipping, if not a grim journey to the dungeon, even women who avoided the streets were not safe from the era's waves of paranoia over witchcraft. A single rumor, a failed love potion, or the envy of a neighbor could see a perfectly innocent made accused of consorting with Satan. Hauled before a church tribunal, she might be subjected to brutal interrogation, if she failed to convince her tormentors of her innocence, the best she could hope for was public humiliation. Paraded through the streets in a hair shirt, while onlookers jeered, the worst outcome was far more horrificing: to be burned alive, her flesh consumed by fire as the righteous looked on, convinced of their own virtue, But perhaps the cruelest fate of all awaited the truly desperate girl. Imagine the terror and shame of a woman who tried to hide an unwanted pregnancy, only to have her secret exposed when the lifeless body of her child was discovered in some ditch or refuse heap, In the eyes of medieval law, such an act was more than a crime. It was blasphemy, a monstrous inversion of the sacred duty of motherhood. For those convicted of infanticide, the journey to the gallows was especially cruel. Often, the condemned woman would be forced to carry the tiny, swaddled corpse of her child to the scaffold, the eyes of the entire community burning into her as she made her final walk of agony. In some of the harshest corners of Christendom, the punishment was even more nightmarish. Some records whisper that she might be buried alive with her child, their bodies doomed to decay together in a single, unmarked grave, Such were the rigid moral codes that ensnared women in the Middle Ages, a world where the ever-present threat of hellfire and social ruin shadowed every misstep, Yet even the stern men who sat in judgment were not immune to temptation, as the sordid chronicles of clerical corruption make all too clear, in an age when the church wielded immense worldly power alongside spiritual authority, even the highest priests and bishops often fell prey to the very sins they condemned. Prepare yourself, dear listener, for a brief descent into the scandalous underbelly of medieval faith, a tale of greed, hypocrisy, and vice festering at the heart of Christendom itself, where to begin with the failings of the so-called holy. Perhaps with the sin of simony, the all-too-common trade in church offices, bought and sold like grain at market, in a time when a bishopric could bring vast estates and command over armies of serfs. It is little wonder that ambitious clerics vied for such power with bribes and backroom deals. As we've seen, the harsh realities endured by medieval criminals were far removed from the romantic legends of dashing highwaymen and merry outlaws. Most led desperate, filthy, and brief existences driven to crime by hunger, abuse, or sheer necessity. Even the rare few who found fleeting fortune usually met a grisly end, publicly executed as a warning to others. Yet, perhaps there's a strange comfort to be found in these dark tales from our past. They remind us of how far we have come, however imperfect our world remains, no longer must the desperate rob travelers or risk mutilation for stealing a loaf of bread. Crime and injustice still exist, but they pale in comparison to the everyday brutalities faced by our medieval ancestors. So tonight, as you settle into the warmth of your bed, spare a thought for those condemned souls, the Jack Cornwalls and Robert of Altons, who cried out from dungeon cells or swung from gallows, forsaken by the world, may their suffering not be entirely forgotten. May we learn from their hard lives to build a society of greater justice and compassion. The medieval world can feel impossibly distant, separated from us by centuries of struggle and progress. But in truth, those who lived then were much like us. They longed for happiness, love, and a better life, though their world made such dreams almost unreachable. Each day was a battle to survive, whether by prayer or by crime. In that, perhaps, we find a common thread, a recognition of the enduring human spirit that has carried us through plague, war, famine, and tyranny to the relative peace and prosperity we know today. We are the heirs of their suffering, the fortunate few who have made it to a brighter dawn. So, my fellow traveler, drift off tonight with gratitude for the comforts and freedoms you enjoy. The security of your home, the warmth of your bed, the protections of law and custom. These are the hard-won gifts of countless generations who endured hardship so we might thrive. As sleep overtakes you, let your last thoughts be ones of compassion for those lost souls whose struggles shaped our world. May they rest in peace, knowing their pain was not in vain. Thus ends our journey through the dark annals of medieval crime. I hope you found it a fascinating, if grim, voyage into a lost world of desperation and brutality. There are many more stories of daring escapes, infamous scandals, and corrupt officials, but those must wait for another night. If you appreciated our time together, I would be honored if you'd show your support with a like or a subscribe. It truly helps me keep the torches burning here at the Boring History Company. If not, no worries. I'm simply grateful for your company on this journey. Thank you, dear listener, for sharing your imagination and curiosity. I hope you'll join me again soon for another adventure into the forgotten past. But for now, I wish you good night and the sweetest of dreams. May your sleep be as undisturbed as a medieval king's, free from the cares of the world. Until next time, this is your humble host, signing off.